Welcome, everyone, to the first of 6 sessions sponsored by the California Library Association and funded through the State Library of California. Obviously, what we'll be doing over the next 6 sessions, including today's session, is looking at the ins and outs of training other people to train material that we think that they need and that we hope will make their work life a lot more productive, a lot more easy, and a lot more engaging. The approach that I'm going to take here is to engage in a fair amount of discussion so that we can draw off your experiences and have you walk out of the whole series with something that's concrete, positive, and actionable. For me, learning is all about transformation, and the transformation will start with us looking through the entire series at things that we can produce. Tell you right up here, spoiler alert, sessions 5 and 6, we're going to have you doing presentations so you get a chance to actually present things. And the themes will be around what you got from the leadership program that you've already been in this year through CLA and through the CLA leadership program. So start thinking from moment one about the issues that came up, the things that were important to you in those previous leadership things, and think about how elements of that might work out for you to train back to your own staff. And from day one, start working toward a theme that you can be presenting to the whole group in sessions 5 and 6, which is all of about 2.5 weeks away. So there's plenty of time here. No stress, no pressure. We're just going to have a good time. Taking the image that's behind me on the screen of the campfire was obviously an intentional choice. For me, campfires and fires in general evoke a lot of different things. They evoke a sense of community when we sit around and we tell stories at a campfire. They evoke creativity and imagination, those sparks of fire, the flames that go up into the air and get us excited about things. There's a lot of metaphors we can pull from that. And I just thought that was a nice way for us to start as we try to look at a series of trainings that will help you up your skills and also help you become more cognizant of the idea of communities of learning. When we talk about, I am looking at something that's surprising me. It looks like I've pulled up the wrong deck, so I'm going to pause the recording. And we are back with the right slide deck this time. Hooray! As I was saying to people, for those of you watching the archive version, total disclosure here. When you are doing presentations like what I'm doing today and getting yourself started, if things go wonky, the first thing you do is don't panic. Take a deep breath. The second thing is admit to the learners what's going on so that they realize you haven't just totally powdered out on them, but that you're working toward getting things fixed. And the third thing is, if you're doing a recording, do what I just did. You pause it long enough to get the problem fixed so that those of you watching the archive recording don't have to suffer through the chat that we were having while I was getting this up here. So to set the tone for this, a quote from George Couros from Innovate Inside the Box. I'm not the kind of trainer that reads you things that you can read yourself, so let me stop long enough for you to look at that quote and absorb it. Oh, and somebody's at the door. We got a new member. I'm going to look across the top screen, see if it's somebody that we were expecting to be doing an introduction, which I'm not seeing. Okay. So there's the quote. George Couros. You're going to hear a lot today about George and Katie Novak, who wrote a book called Innovate Inside the Box. And I'll explain a little bit more why you're going to hear about them later. But George and Katie's spirit is going to flow through a lot of the presentation. A, because I think they're great educators. B, because they're engaging. And C, because the experience I had as a learner and something that they did online is an extraordinary example that we can take as trainers when we try to train others. So there's our idea that we're looking at a work of art when we do things. And in any session like this, what we obviously want to do is set the tone up front for the training. If we were face-to-face, we would be doing an exercise that would allow you to reset the physical room in a way that worked for you. It comes from an old exercise that Peter Block, a consultant that I adore, used to do, where he'd look out and say, you're a bunch of trainers, is the room set up right? And everybody would say no. And he'd say, okay, fix it. You have 2 minutes to fix it. Since we can't essentially fix the virtual room that we're in, one thing I want to make sure is that you are at least able to see each other across the top of the screen there. And what I'm going to do for this introductory exercise is I'll move us across from what I'm seeing left to right. So if you're seeing what I'm seeing, Laura's first, Victor's second, et cetera, et cetera. The quick exercise here is to do just a couple of things. And that's introductions and your purpose. Notice that I'm only asking for 2 things: where you work and a learning goal you have for the session. I'm going to give you about 20 seconds to think about it. Like, I didn't know I had to have goals here. So before I say, Laura, you're on, let's just take about 15, 20 seconds. Everybody think about one thing that you want to get out of this session. Clearly, while you're doing this, I'm going to be taking notes so that I make sure that we are hitting those things today and in the other sessions that we have together. So all that said, Laura, if you want to unmute, where you work and your learning goal for the Train the Trainer session that we're doing together.
I think before we do that, I don't know that we've gotten like a broad overview of what all of the Train the Trainer sessions are supposed to be geared towards. So that might be really helpful. I don't know if anybody else has gotten like a summary of Train the Trainer.
Well, we were just going to surprise you. You mean you actually want to know where we're going?
I mean, to form a goal, you know.
All right, well, that's a great reminder. When we finish these introductions, come back to me with it. I'm going to make a big note to myself, goals of the program and a quick outline. Another thing here, we will oftentimes, as I'm doing this kind of conversation with you, do what I call going under the hood and explain why something is being done in these sessions, so that that in itself can show you what I thought about, right or wrong, in terms of how I approach this, and how you can take those same tips if they work for you. You take what works for you, you ignore what doesn't work for you. You notice I did not at the beginning say, here's where the virtual bathrooms are, and here's what we're going to do over the next 6 weeks. About 3 months ago, I was reading a wonderful book by Priya Parker, The Art of Gathering. You can see I'm looking at it because it's still up on top of my desk, even though the library wants it back right now. She made a point about halfway through about how great entertainment goes right to the heart of things. You don't have all those things up front. And something to think about in learning is, we know from research that's been done, the average learner will remember 3 or 4 things out of an entire session, whether it's an hour, half a day, or a full day. So what you don't want to blow, if you want people to remember 3 or 4 things, is spend your first 5 minutes talking about the bathrooms and the goals of the course. You really want to get to the heart of things, which is why when I formally started, before I messed up my slide deck, was I wanted to talk about that whole thing of a community around a campfire, telling stories, working together, developing that. It goes to the heart of what we'll do. So it was intentional, not at this point to have started by saying, here's what we'll do today, here's what we'll do next week, because that puts me to sleep, puts you to sleep too. But I had assumed that there had been enough descriptions for you, and we'll circle back to that. Is that a good long-winded way of saying I didn't really mess up, but I think I did?
No, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, then. All right, so where you work and your learning goal, well, as far as you can go with that. This will evolve, of course.
So my name is Laura Jenkins. I work at the Huntington Beach Public Library, and I guess my learning goal for this session would be to learn more about what the trainer sessions are going to mean, and how I can effectively be a leader and trainer in my workplace for others.
Great. Next one on my list, or you should be able to see is Victor, you're up. So if you want to unmute.
Can I just say ditto what she said?
Oh, are you repeating what Laura's saying? I'm having a little trouble hearing what she said.
Yeah, no, definitely my goal
Ditto,
is,
huh?
No, yeah, I'm trying to gather as much as I can about this session. My main goal is try to become an effective facilitator, trainer, on a formal and informal settings, be able to round out the concept. I have some experience on it, but I'd definitely like to see how it differs from my previous experiences.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Next person would be Denise. And Denise, you're still muted. So if you can unmute yourself, let's get where you
Good
work.
morning. Good morning. I'm unmuted. I'm Denise McIver, and I'm currently the research librarian at the California African American Museum, which is here in Southern California. I've been here for about a little over 9 years. My learning goals. It's really important for me to enhance and build upon what I've already learned as a result of going through two master's degree program. The most recent one at the Drucker School of Management, where I learned that the first principle of leadership is to learn how to self-manage. So I'm very interested in just building upon the knowledge and also mentoring others. That's a big deal to me, especially young women of color.
I've already sketched out our whole 6 session thing, and I don't have a specific element at this point on mentoring, so I'll make sure I add that in. Thank you. Make sure we get to that. Am I pronouncing this right, Maxime?
Yes, that's correct.
Great.
I work in Beverly Hills Public Library. I'm a department manager, and my goal is to further just expand and advance my knowledge and skills, and to hopefully become a more efficient team leader.
Great. Let's skip Christine because we already know her learning goals. Her learning goals are to make sure that this goes right. Inga. And I think you're also still muted, Inga. So.
Oh, I pressed something, then I lost the screen. I'm Inga Chopra. I most recently was a youth services librarian at Santa Monica Public Library, but have been at helm since last July. So with the leadership program, I hope to, absorb all the new information about being a better leader, and then hopefully put that in practice when I'm back to work.
Fantastic. Now I'm going to struggle. I'm going to try it, and you correct me if I'm wrong. Mahasin?
Mahasin, almost.
Mahasin. Thank you.
I'm Mahasin Alim. I'm a Children's Collection Management Librarian for Oakland Public Library in Oakland, California. My learning goal is to learn how to be a effective facilitator of workplace initiatives, and also how to make my workplace better at offering like in-service learning and training. It's one of those things that we do a lot of, but no one's ever taught us how to do. so I'm excited to finally have some like instruction in how this should best happen. So thanks.
Wonderful. I will interject a brief thing here. There is a whole book out, I think, called The Accidental Trainer, which describes how most of us get into training. I think almost all of us involved in training at some point have had a boss that came up and said something along the lines of, wow, you talk pretty. You want to be a trainer? You're a new trainer. You go, oh, and you spent 3 or 4 years learning what that means. And finally, after you go, I wish somebody told me that 4 years ago. My own experience came through Cheryl, who you know from what you've gone through. Cheryl was doing a Train the Trainer series with a lot of other colleagues back in 2001 for info people. And 28 of us, 2 from each library involved, were taken down to Southern California. I want to say they put bags over our head in masses, but it was nothing like that. It was this wonderful series, 4 intensive days, face to face, I think 9 to 5 each day. And it really set a good structure for many of us that had not had that kind of formal training. We were shrieking a little less when we came out of it thinking, well, that's a good jump start on helping us. And I'm hoping you're all going to get that same thing here. And Allison, your own answer to that. Again, where you work and your learning goal.
My name is Allison. I'm the Programs Outreach and Youth Services Manager for Monterey County Free Libraries in Monterey County. And my goal for the trainer is I feel like I'm pretty good at public speaking, but can get a little rambly sometimes. So I'm trying to work on being more concise and impactful with what I say in like a shorter amount of time, so that people actually retain what I'm saying.
I think we're going to hit 2 topics over the next couple of weeks that will be very much of interest to you. One is the concept of the elevator speech, having ready in 30 seconds what you want to say, and taking that into your training so that you know how to do that kind of introduction and bring people along with you. So the elevator speech is part 1 of it. And the other concept is a concept used in education a lot, the concept of chunking. Where instead of giving an hour or 2 or 3 of lectures, you chunk your content into brief periods. You'll see, again, taking us under the hood, when I'm at my best in this series, I will be chunking. There will be a couple of times today when I'm probably going to go on for more than 5 or 6 minutes, but I try to do brief introductions like you saw at the very beginning of this. And when new information is presented out there, give a 5 or 6 minute chunk of information and then have the learners work on it immediately. You'll see a lot more of that next week when we kind of go to a flipped classroom model. So having said all that, let's come back to the thing that I'm going to move back so that I refresh my memory here. I think pictures changed a little bit. So now it's not the same order I saw. The first person who talked was talking about wanting the goals. That was Laura. So what is the actual structure of the program? Today's section is going to be the introduction to training and looking a little bit about how you train other people, but we're going to look at our environment, what I call our learning landscape. And we'll look at some of the things that I think are essential for trainers to have, some of the skills they have, some of the characteristics they have. That'll be that first little presentation I keep referring to that was inspired by George Koros and Katie Novak in something that they did experimentally online. Second half of this, we'll start getting into more of the things that are going to be useful to you in terms of applying them immediately. Toward the end of the session, we're going to be talking about how to keep in touch with each other between sessions and see if we need some kind of a course discussion area. There is a challenge for us in that if we set up a formal CLA chat spot, CLA has to be involved in the management of it, and that's kind of going to take away the spontaneity of what I want to be able to do with you in a brief period of time. So my challenge to you at the end of today will be think about what platform we might use. There is a Facebook account that you can get into. Christine can invite you into that if you're interested, but I know not everybody uses Facebook, so that may not work. I had originally thought that a Slack community would be good, but if I set that up, then I'm in charge of that under CLA, and it's going to have to be managed a little bit differently. But you'll hear me say often, I think it's important for learners to take the initiative and for initiatives to be learner driven. So if somebody outside of CLA in the course wanted to set up a Slack community for us and invite everybody in, that's a possibility. But we'll come back to that. We'll circle back to that later. Session 2 is going to start looking at the first half of the design and training process, where you assess the need for something. You start to design in response to the needs you've identified, and then you start to develop, which is actually where you're writing your scripts, plotting out how you're going to do your lessons, get your lesson plan, your slide deck, and all that good stuff. Session 3 will be day of delivery and evaluation. So we'll have a lot to say to each other and experiment a lot with what you do face-to-face, what you do online, what you do when we're back to having blended environments, which is it could start face-to-face and then jump online. It could be something online that occasionally has some face-to-face meetings. And there are just a variety of different ways to do that. So we'll look at those in session 3 when we talk about how to present and be an effective presenter and engage your learners, and then how to do the follow-up that produces results. Session 4 is going to be the transition, where we talk about what you got out of the earlier leadership components that you did with Cheryl and how you're going to translate that specifically in your own workplace. And the end of that should be with you deciding, here's a topic I want to work on. Like I want to take the communication component and do a train the trainer session. Session 5, some people will present and we'll do some critiques. Session 6, other people will do their presentations and we'll critique. Critiquing should not be something you dread. Critiquing should be the act of hearing in kind of a master class format, first from the other people in the group, what they liked, what they didn't like, and suggestions for how it could be better. And then I'll jump back in and plug any gaps there that I see based on what's going on. By the end of session 6, you should have a workable component that you can take back into your own workplace and immediately use to train other trainers. So today we get our feet wet, then we get into the mechanics of it, and then we start tying this back to the content that you've had, and you walk out of here by the end of these things 3 weeks from, well, this is week 1, so week 2, week 3, at the end of that, you walk out with something you can use. Any questions or concerns from anybody? If there are no concerns, we'll always keep this moving fast, but you can just type no into the chat so I know to move on. If you do have questions, unmute and let's deal with those right up front.
I have a quick question.
Please, Mahasin.
Just in terms of time outside of these sessions, do you have an estimate on, it sounds like we will need to do some preparation outside. Do you just have an idea of how much? And then if we have to like miss a session, can you just speak to any concerns about that?
Yeah, these should all be recorded and available to you. So if you miss a session, that just adds on to your outside the session time that you put into it. You'll have a 2-hour recording to look at if you have time. If you don't have time, look, we're all adults. I'm big on the idea that learners learn at their own speed and they focus on what they need. If you miss a session, you don't have time to listen to the 2-hour thing, you should have access to the PowerPoint deck that I've provided, and that has extensive speaker notes. As is clear to you, I'm not sitting here reading from that script. That to me is my security blanket. But if you don't have time to watch a 2-hour recording, you can go through the slide deck, and the heart of it is the notes, not the slides. Notice I am not putting bullet points up here. I've got to get my finger where it shows. I don't use a lot of bullets. I use a lot of visual images, and I make these trainings interactive so that really the content is what we're exchanging back and forth that way. So step 1 is how much time on average I would be hopeful that you can carve out an hour or two a week. If you're spending more than that, kudos to you, but it's not required from my point of view. My thing is, if you have 5 minutes between each session to spend on it, that's what you're going to do. And those 5 minutes, you'll focus on the thing that gives you what you most need. If you have the hour or two, then that means you might have time to watch those advanced videos that I'll put out. And a word about that too. In terms of style, I mentioned today's style is showing you what to do with a PowerPoint deck in an online environment. Notice that it's in the background. I don't know if any of you have used this yet, but within Zoom, if you go into the advanced settings, there's a way to set your deck as your background. That's different than what we normally see, where I'm on the left and this PowerPoint slides on the right, or vice versa. There's nothing wrong with that. And I will probably use that technique at one point during this, just so that we could see the difference in how it works. But what I really liked about this, and what I wanted to do in the hope that this would just wow you and excite you in a way, if we can get excited about learning, is the idea of this as close right now as I can come to feeling like we are in the same room, where we can kind of see each other at the top of the screen or down the side of your screen. I'm speaking to you and hoping that I'm the center of keeping the conversation going, but you're the center as learners. And the slide deck is like we're in an auditorium and it's behind me up on a big screen. So we're with Zoom and with this virtual ability that we have, that's what I'm trying to do today. So next week, our next session 2, it's going to be a little bit more flipped classroom. So there will be 3 short videos. I think each of them is 1 or 2 minutes. Christine and I will put those out to you by the end of the day with the links to them. And they're also on one of the final slides in today's presentation. So the question was, what are we doing? I think I've explained those 6 sessions and what we're trying to get out of it. I've explained to you the style that I'm using and said there will be different styles I use as a presenter and a facilitator, in the hope that these will inspire you to try them. And an underlying thing here is always the idea of you try with the expectation that sometimes it will not work. Case in point, about 10 minutes ago, I was starting to show you the deck and I went, oh, wrong slide. That happens. It happens to the best. And I'm not the best, mind you, but it happens to the best presenters. And the trick here is, don't let it throw you. A bit of neuroscience, as much as I know of it, the way our minds work, the neocortex is open when we are calm. When stress starts to set up, it shuts down more and more and more. As the neocortex shuts down, our ability to take in information shuts down also. So the more stressed you are, the harder it is for you to react to the stressful thing that you're facing, and the worse you're going to be at it, which is why I gave that pointer right up front. Deck's wrong. Okay, just cop to it. Take a deep breath. It's not the end of the world. Fix it and then go on. That keeps the neocortex open and keeps us learning, and it keeps us active. If you're ever in a learning situation where you sense that you're getting stressed out or your learners are getting stressed out, there is no reason why you shouldn't just say, I'm sensing that a break would be a good thing here. And take a short break and tell people to breathe. Walk around the room, walk outside the room. I don't know, a boss who I adored, we were working in Monterey. He was a director of the museum there when I was working as his assistant. And I asked Tom one day, what do you do when you're stressed out? And Tom would say, well, I'd leave my office and I walk around the galleries and I look at the art. Then what about on a really tough day? He said, well, get outside and I'll walk around the garden outside and maybe take a short walk up Alvarado Street. If you know Monterey, you know, it's about a 7-block area. It's like a sneeze of a walk, but it's a lovely walk. In 15, 20 minutes, you can do that walk and be back in your office. And so at that point, I said to Tom, now what do you do on a really, really bad day? If you understand California geography, you know, Northern California, you'll love this. Tom said, on a bad day, I walk all the way to Salinas, which was about 20 or 25 miles. That's how good we have to be. We have to keep our stress levels down, and we have to just breathe and do that stuff. I'm going to take a brief second here and look back over chat to see if there's anything that I need to see and react to there. Denise observed from a few minutes ago, slight mishaps are fine. They underscore our collective humanity. Exactly. Exactly. She also said, my first trainers were my parents. Yes. Our trainers in our lives are so important to us, and they're everywhere. When we recognize that everybody in our life at some level is a trainer, the people we admire are the trainers that we emulate, and the people that we absolutely don't want to spend any time around, those are the people who have taught us, don't do that to your learners. Never do that to your learners. There's something to be learned from everybody. And Allison saying she used to do that. Did you ever walk to Salinas, Allison? Or
No, that's so far.
Haven't had those kind of Tom days, have you?
I get annoyed when I even have to drive to Salinas.
So that's not going to take down the stress. Walking or driving to Salinas is going to make it more stressful for you. Sorry,
Yeah.
Tom, it doesn't work. Yeah, I love Monterey. I lived down there for a while my wife was going to school, and that little library got me through so much. Still in
Yeah.
touch with colleagues there through
I
CLA.
live in Pacific Grove and I used to work for the Monterey Public Library.
Yeah. I was at the Monterey Peninsula Museum of Art, so I was right up the street from you, but unfortunately, time being what it was, we weren't there at the same time.
Yeah.
And he says, I believe in short meetings done outside while walking. Absolutely. I mean, the more creative you can be, and what Denise has just talked about in terms of meetings, bring that into your training too. This makes us all better. One final thing, notice that I did a very kind of a mean thing, but I wanted to make a point here of looking at our environment and taking advantage of it. In the introductions and purpose, notice I deliberately did not ask your name. I said where you work and learning goals. I wanted to do that because I knew most people are into the rote habit of saying their names and would anyway. But I was thinking about this with Denise or with Christine yesterday as we were fine tuning this. I said, we can all see each other's names up there. And as long as I'm smart enough to move that little thing back and forth so you can see who's speaking, the names there, I thought, let's just see what happens if I don't ask people to say their names, if we can introduce ourselves because the names are visible. And it sort of worked, but most people fell into the comfort zone of saying their names. Nothing right or wrong about it. But another little point when you're a trainer, again, people only remember 2 or 3 things. You do not want to bury them under a lot of facts. So the more you can do to get the things that are essential out there, and in this exercise, the essential thing was, let's talk about what our goals are, and let's make sure that I, as your facilitator, am not going to miss any of those things and address those over the next 5 sessions as well as today. Let's focus on those things. And the where you work thing is a little bit of community building for those that don't already know each other inside out. So that's all a long way of saying we're about 35 minutes into a 2-hour session already. Is anybody surprised that we've had that much time go by? Does it feel like it's been 35 minutes?
Well, when the conversation is good, time flies.
Perfect. And there's another little tip for you in terms of online training, online learning, and Zoom. We hear a lot about Zoom fatigue. I read a lot about that, and I totally understand that. Nobody wants to be sitting in their chair in front of a computer for 8 hours, staring at a little blue light, which you do as a presenter so that people know that you're looking at them rather than looking down at your slides and making them think you're looking at their shirt or their crotch or looking somewhere else. That the whole thing of making the eye contact makes it lively, and discussion keeps us going. So yes, there is Zoom fatigue, but I think a lot of it is the same as meeting fatigue face to face, where if you are not an active participant, time moves very slowly. So you have to keep it lively. There's a lot of research out there talking about attention spans. I love reading I can't remember the author's name now, but there was a book called The Shallows, and the gist of the book was the internet has shortened our attention span so much that people can't read books anymore, and they can't do anything that takes more than 5 or 10 minutes, and it's all lost. And I thought as I read the book, wait a minute, attention spans have disappeared, so we can't read books. You just wrote a book. How did you do that if your attention span disappeared? So there's something there to make us skeptical about this. The best, most convincing research I've seen suggests that 8 to 10 minutes is a good period of time to be doing one thing. And if you don't change it up, you start to lose people. But it depends on the circumstances too. 30 or 40 minutes like we just did, I didn't see anybody run off to get a cup of coffee. I didn't see anybody checking their email. I am watching you. I'm looking right at you. It's engaging, and that's what we have to do in learning. If we're going to do anything out of today's session, one of the 3 things I would hope you would remember would be make it engaging. And the secondary thing would be make it learner-centric. Certainly, I tell you stories on my own experience to keep the storytelling side of this going, but it's not about me. It's about us as a community being better in our environments. I'm going to look back to the chat because I think there were some comments about that. You know, one person, I'm looking out people here. One person said, I went straight to saying my name and title, laughing out loud. We all do that. Another person said, I don't think I said my name or where I work. I think you might have, but I have to check back on my notes, which I'm not going to do right now. Denise says, I've grown very impatient while awaiting my order at Starbucks, but I love reading books. You can spend the whole day doing it. Making it engaging is also to make it interesting. And there is something to just write on your forehead or put on a sticky note or take notes for yourself. When you go back after these 2 hours today, where we're going to have some good laughs together and we're going to do some serious learning. Remember, unless you're writing it down and reviewing it, it's not getting in there. So that idea of making it engaging is also to make it interesting, which Denise just perfectly captured in that comment, is one of the things I would strongly urge you to write down and go back to. And as you design the learning you're going to do for your own people, and you present those things in sessions 5 and 6 of this series, keep that up there. Make sure that you're engaging. So 40 minutes into it, and we've done all this stuff, and we set the room and had this exercise. Unmute yourself or put into chat what words come to mind as you consider what we just did. Don't filter here. The first words that come to mind. Think about that last 40 minutes. What describes it in a word or a term? Don't make me call you out. It gets ugly if I have to call you out.
Yeah, I have to echo what Mahasan put in the chat. You really set the tone and expectations and kind of introduced us to your personality as a presenter.
And I got one.
And what we can expect from you as we move forward with the sessions.
Thank you. Anybody else? I'll read a couple of the chat comments. Set the tone and expectations, good overview, a lot of information, active room engagement, roadmap. You'll hear me later in the series talk about a great colleague of mine, Sardik Love. It's Sardek, and love spelled exactly as it sounds, Love. Sardik is a wonderful presenter, a great colleague. I love hanging with him at conferences. And he talks about, he does a whole master facilitation series, which is spectacular. It costs a lot more than what this series is costing you. But Sardik is just a master of facilitation. And he always talks about, if you want to facilitate conversations, ask questions. That's one way of setting the tone here. Ask those questions, get people engaged. Inge is saying casual, engaging. Alice is saying fun, warm, exciting, high energy. Oh, tell the people who are around me a lot that I'm fun. They get tired of my same old jokes over and over again. See, you're fresh meat. I get to tell those jokes and they're all new to you. And Denise is saying, can you put his name? Sure. Name of the person that I've done. He has not done a TED Talk that I'm aware of. I'm kind of surprised because he's really at that level now. After today's session, if you go look up Sardik online, he's got a book that might be of interest to you. It's more the business side of presentation than the chops of how to be a great presenter. But he and Ann Bruce, I'm going to pull that book off my shelf so I can share the title with you. The book is called Speak for a Living, The Insider's Guide to Building a Speaking Career. He and Ann Bruce wrote it. Lovely story about them. Ann wrote the first edition of the book. I didn't know Ann. I met Sardik and we did a lot of work together, colleague to colleague, mind you, at conferences and things like that. And Sardik at one point offered to mentor me because he wanted to try out some information that some courses he was designing for facilitation. I thought, wow, great. Free training from Sardik. I'm all in. So he would give me lessons. We would do online consultations back and forth every few weeks. And toward the end of that whole process, we both went to a conference and I saw Ann's book, the first edition of Speak for a Living. Picked it up and started reading it on the way home on the plane, read about half of it on that flight cross country from Washington, D.C. back to San Francisco. Next time Sardik and I talked, I said, you know, that book is fascinating. I'm glad I picked it up because it so much mirrors what you've been telling me. And he started to laugh. He goes, she was my mentor. She turned around and asked Sardik to co-write the second edition of the book. So they're the co-authors on that. That's how our training world works. Any other words that come to mind as you consider what we just did? If not, we'll move on and we'll start to get into the heart of the first part of what, well, actually, one of the questions I wanted to ask you, what are your reactions suggest in terms of how you approach training other trainers? And again, being totally transparent here, this is where I'm taking our content. And instead of this just being a fun conversation that we'll forget 5 minutes from now, this is solidifying it in by repeating things and making the connection between what you've heard and what you want to walk away with. So what reactions do you have in terms of how you approach training other trainers? Let's get a few people to unmute here and just put those out there audibly for people. There's one in the chat, Denise. I make certain I meet them where they are. Perfect. Anybody else?
I like training people in general. But like I was saying at the beginning for goals, I feel like I'm a little too chatty sometimes and lose track of like the point. But I do like public speaking and I like interacting with other people like my staff. So I think I'm good in that sense, but maybe not as clear as I want to be. So I think I bring the fun and the high energy, but lose track of the point.
Another way to do that is if you're in a virtual environment like we are, obviously I've got the little time indicator on my computer in the lower right-hand corner. And I keep looking at that, see how we're doing on timing. And right now I'm going, eep, I'm a little bit behind where I want to be, but you know, it's okay. We'll get through what we need to get through. And if we don't do everything that's in the slide deck today, we can come back to it. Another great tip for you, never let the slide deck guide and drive the session. These conversations have been so useful that they're much better than a lot of slides I could have shown you. Mahasin says, I try to let them know where we're headed. I always start with the objective and agenda, try to pause to make sure there's space for more quiet folks to participate because I can dominate. Absolutely, same deal. You've probably noticed now that there are pauses in this, which for people that are not used to it, that can be very uncomfortable. That moment of silence, you're thinking, I need to fill that. And one of the things we all need to train ourselves over and over again is not to fill those silences. The silences give you a chance to think through and reflect and absorb what's going on. And Denise says, and why labor to create a slide deck? You know, that's a great question. Why labor to create a slide deck? The slide deck, if used effectively, for me at least, becomes part of the presentation, but not the presentation. If we let our slide deck define what success is, meaning, oh, I showed all 60 slides, so I was successful, as opposed to, well, I had 60 slides, but I showed 30. But the result was, with those 30 that we had some discussions that were so meaningful for people that they got the learning that they really needed. That's a real sign of success. Also, for me, a slide deck is more than just something I use for the presentation itself or for the learning experience. Slide deck becomes a learning tool. I mentioned to you at the beginning of this, for those that don't have time to go back and listen to a 2-hour recording later, the slide decks are there where you can skim the notes and you'll get what you need. What you'll be missing, of course, is the interaction that we had, which is, to my way of thinking, the real heart of it. So this is not to diminish the importance of a slide deck, and a good slide deck at that. We'll talk a lot about that in terms of presentation styles and what to put there and what not to put there. Everybody has their own approach to it. But my feeling is you do that as a starting point, but it's not the thing that defines the whole experience. Denise, do you have any reaction to that, or does that make sense to you? Good. Okay. Anybody else? All right, so lots of discussion there. Let's go. The next, some background here. I'm going to leave this up so that you can kind of get a sense of where we're going here. The next 8 slides are based on George Kouros's book with Katie Novak, Innovate Inside the Box. I'm going to put that title in here. I think it's up on some of the slides, but let me make sure you got that in chat too. So the book is fantastic. I mean, if you really want to take the time to look at some educators who have talked about what goes into learning and how we can make it more engaging, try Kouros's book, The Innovator's Mindset, and try their joint book, Innovate Inside the Box. The reason this is up here is because back about a year ago, as I mentioned earlier, George and Katie decided they were going to do a book discussion group. The platform was Instagram. Now, I love George's work, and as soon as I saw that he and Katie were teaming up to do something on that book I'd already started to read, and that they were going to use Instagram, I was all over it thinking, I've never seen Instagram as a learning tool, even if just to see how they use it. Even if I put some time in just for that purpose, I will walk away with something that's very valuable to me. I got into the exercises they did, which was after each set of chapters, 2 or 3 chapters at a time, they would say something like, take one of the things we're talking about, one of the skills of a great educator, and do an Instagram post that responds to that. So what I've done here is take taken 8 of those things that I did with 8 things that they consider to be the elements of great educators and for us, great trainers, and focused on them and showed you the slide or the Instagram image I came up with. I'm doing this for a couple of reasons. One, because I think these are well worth noting and remembering as we think about what makes us great trainers. And also, I want you to see the progress in where I went from my first image to one of the last ones. Now, the first 2 are not up on this screen. This is the third of the images I created, but the first from the book. And I'll deal with that after this when we look at all of them together. But the first thing that they talk about is empathy. So let me stop so you can read that quote and struggle to read it. It isn't the easiest thing to read. And because my bad design on there made it a little hard to read, I will read this for anybody that's struggling. They're saying in the book, when we do our best to understand the situation of others, it is more likely we're going to create opportunities to serve others. Now, as I was deciding how I was going to respond to that on Instagram and do a post for that course, I went back to my own tablet where I've got a lot of pictures I've taken over the last decade and looked for something that I thought showed empathy and made me immediately respond. And there was this picture I took here on Market Street in San Francisco during March for Our Lives about a year ago. I looked at those kids, I snapped that picture, took dozens and dozens of pictures that day. And when I went home that night and sort of debriefed and pulled out what I thought was most stunning, I thought, that kid with that sign, "Am I next?" speaks to empathy as fast as you can get there. You can talk all day long about stats, about the number of people killed in this country by guns. We can talk about the tragedies out there. But one kid holding that sign and asking, "Am I next?" that gets us there. And I would suggest to you as trainers, we want that level of empathy, both for our learners to feel that toward us, but more importantly, us feeling that toward our learners. So when we do our initial exercises and whatever icebreakers that we throw into training, we want to do it in a way that isn't just fun and giggly and explosive to get people going up front, but a way that starts to develop a sense of community that goes into a community of learning. So for me, the idea of empathy and taking that image was a good starting point in that particular online exploration. The second thing they talk about is how we need to be problem finders as well as solvers. So let me stop so you can see this quote. And again, in our setting, we're going to just translate the word students into learners and think of them as lifelong learners and ask ourselves, what can we do to help them to go beyond what they need to learn and how they apply it? You'll hear me when we get to assessment at the beginning of the process of training and evaluation at the end of it, thinking about, let's find out what the real transformation is that we need to do. Let's find out how we can encourage our learners to apply that and be creative and co-conspirators in the learning process. If we're going to do that, then they need to find the problems they want to identify, and they need to help solve those problems through their own learning and then turn it around. So for you as learners, your problem is to figure out what you need immediately in your own workplaces to train others on, and you have to find the solutions to the learning gaps that you're trying to fill there. So something jump into chat. So let me stop here. Denise is saying, I think it's relatively easy to find the problems, especially in the world we inhabit today. Absolutely. I would say a failure in training, and I see this a lot, is that trainers don't encourage their learners to be the problem finders and the problem solvers. We take it on ourselves as if we think by putting together a PowerPoint deck or giving a lecture that we can lead people through that and it'll produce the solutions, where in fact, the best learning comes from somebody being stimulated by what you give them and then working with that to meet the need. They talk in the book of being risk takers in learning. Again, the quote's a little hard to read, so I will read this one to you. The more we hold ourselves back from jumping in, the more we make excuses why we shouldn't even try in the first place. So risk taking, I think, is an essential part of training, teaching, and learning. We are taking risks when we go in front of that group and we think we know what they need and we try to facilitate a solution to that as best as possible. But if we don't encourage people to take risks and fail and try again, we're missing a maxim that my colleagues and I say to each other repeatedly, often, and that is learn to fail. Part of that and fail to learn, actually. When you fail, you're learning something and you come back, and that's a short-term failure that builds toward a longer-term success. So accept that as part of your own learning process. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. Denise putting in the quote from Steve Jobs, fail fast. Absolutely. There's a great story. I wish I could remember who said this. I read it 20 or 30 years ago. So now I've lost sight of it, but it was the head of a huge company here in the United States. And he told the story of an employee who had made a huge financial mistake. It cost the company well over $1 million. The employee apparently just went in expecting to be sacked immediately and said to the head of the company, when's my last day? And the employer, the head of the CEO, roared back at the person, fire you, fire. I just invested $1 million in you. Why would I fire you now? I want you to learn from that. So if we take risks and we understand that that's okay, and set aside the fear of failure and instead concentrate on what it takes to get to success, we're well on the way to being there. That worked. And I think you can probably read that particular quote. If anybody can't, tell me in the chat and I'll read it to you. But let's stop to see about being networked. So it's a theme I assume you're starting to get from me, that I think it's very important that we have communities of learning, both in this train the trainer session and back in your own settings, where people are confident to talk to each other, to express their learning needs to each other, to support each other. Again, one of those stats that you see, and I've never seen documented, but people say up to 90% of what we learn in the workplace is informal learning. And it always raises that question. If 90% is informal, why are we putting so much of our money, so many of our resources into that 10%, which is the formal training stuff? It's up to us for that 10% to make sure that that really supports the rest of it, and that people understand that what you learn in a classroom is the beginning and part of a process, not the end. Being observant is clearly a part of being a trainer and being a learner. If we're not observing the looks on the faces of the learners in our room and seeing if people are still with us or if they're starting to multitask because we've lost them, we miss a very important thing. So again, time to look at the quote there. Personal stories for why I used the peacock here. There's a set of gardens here in the Bay Area called Filoli Gardens. They are lovely, huge old house. It's fantastic to walk through, and gardens that are always doing something throughout the year. For the longest time, walking through the gardens, most of us would pay attention to the flowers, which is what we were supposed to look at. And we would listen to the birds and watch the birds, and we'd walk through that house and see the lovely setting. But few of us took the time to observe that there was this magnificent peacock, Percy, that was kind of walking around and being very showy. But we didn't pay attention to Percy very much because it was the flowers we were going to see. When we started to focus on the fact that Percy was out there, we could no longer go to Filoli without seeing Percy as part of the experience. So establish those Percys in your training, get the things that are important and make sure that people are seeing them. Being creative, again, stepping aside or moving aside so you can see the quote here. So if you are concerned about being too chatty or going on too long, remember that it doesn't have to be a big, long thing that you're giving your learners. The small gifts, the small little chunks that we give learners are the important things. And this guy out in Golden Gate Park taking time to create something. For him, it was probably the joy of doing a painting that he would look at. He probably didn't have any aspirations of putting this into a museum or going to a huge art show and trying to sell it. It was the pleasure that he got out of doing the small act of engaging in creation. And that's us too, and that is our learners. Let us never lose sight of the fact that the learners are creators, as you will be in sessions 5 and 6, when you've created your sessions and tried them out on your peers and celebrated the victories you have, and then gone back and fixed up the things that needed fixing. Being resilient, I just love this. Again, a picture from here in San Francisco. I'm big on looking at things that are examples of themselves, the kind of paradigms in our lives that help us understand things. And this slide especially became one of those circular things where I wanted to write something about resilience. And I want to remind all of us that resilience is an important part of what we do. Again, going back to the very beginning here, being resilient enough to say, okay, wrong slide deck, bring up the right one, and then we go on and we don't concentrate on it, except as I've done, drawing attention to it so that as learners, you understand that that's what we're talking about. So why is this slide about resilience? Because it made me laugh, of course, seeing these legs coming out of a building, like that was a resilient way to try to get in or out of that window. But more importantly, the construction of the slide itself took about 5 or 6 attempts before I finally got it to this level. And I will be the first to admit, it's still not my favorite way to have resolved the problem of putting a quote into a slide that had that particular picture with not a lot of contrast in the image that would allow the type to pop out the way it finally popped out. But the resilience was first starting with one style and it didn't work, trying another and then another and another, and finally getting to this and saying, I still don't think it's 100%, but is it good enough? And the answer is yeah, it's good enough. It makes the point and makes us laugh. So resilience to us is something that we need to build in and understand that it comes from trying something, accepting the failure, and going on again. I see Denise saying, reminds me of the Wizard of Oz. Yes, you and your little dog too. Who gets the broomstick? We'll find that out next week. And I believe this is the final one, reflective. Reflection and learning is so important. Let's stop with the quote so that you can read that. So when we think about training trainers and what we're trying to do, we want to make sure that we're giving the ideas that we express and share with our learners. We want to give time to the learners to absorb that and to put it into action, which is why I keep coming back to, you asked about goals for this course. A goal I hope you all have is to walk away with something usable, something that's transformative for you, something you could share with others and become the masters of training that you all want to be. I was going to get into a debrief at this point, but let us stop here. We're already an hour into this. I want to make sure that people have a little bit of time to take whatever breaks they need. So during this, we're going to take a slightly shorter break than I wanted to. We'll take about 5 minutes in case you need to get up, get coffee, and stretch. While people are doing that, any of you that want to stay on a chat, ask questions about what we've talked about, we'll do an informal chat. So from now, it's actually 2:02. Let's make this easy. 2:02 on my computer at 10:10. Instead of 10:02, 10:10, I'll start back into the formal thing, coming back to creating and critiquing. But I'm going to move us to the slide for intermission time. Oh, we didn't get to any of that, and that's okay because it'll come late. So mid-session break. Take your break, and those of you that want to continue to chat, I'll keep the recording going so that we can do the informal chat, share that with others. What questions do you have at this point? No questions. Have I put everybody to sleep? All right, well, since there are no questions, I'm going to pause the recording, but I'm going to keep this live so that we can, anybody that wants to can put stuff in. I'll start the recording about 6 or 7 minutes from now, which for those people watching the archive version will be time warp. You've just missed 8 minutes. All right, so welcome back from that brief break. In the time that we had the break there, we talked a little bit about learning styles, learning skills, something we'll cover later in the course. But I'm also delighted to say that we've had somebody else join us, and I want to give him a chance to say hello to everybody. But as I look across the top of the screen, we may have lost him. He may have disconnected.
I'm here.
Okay, good. Are you running a camera, Martine?
Yeah, I just wanted to say hello to folks, and I want to thank Paul for putting this together. You know, this was one of those issues that was actually a part of the project last year. It was not completed because of COVID, and we had to kind of stop the process. In the meantime, Paul, in his valiant way, came to the front and helped us out to put together this Train the Trainer program. This is something that's going to be posted on our website, and it'll be kind of a vanilla version, if you will. And the idea is that any of the cohorts can use this if they want to implement some of the knowledge that they've gained through their training to use it at home. And so I'm not going to get in the way here, Paul, but I just wanted to say hello to everybody and thank those who could come today, and knowing that you've all been working very hard, and it's a wonderful thing. So thank you all. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Martine. So nice to hear you here. And also, Christine has pointed out to me something that I was not smart enough to notice up front, that we have a representative from the California State Library. If you'd like to unmute yourself, say anything to the group, you're welcome to do that right now, but don't feel like you have to be on the spot. If you don't want to say, no, I'll give it a pass, but chance to say hello.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I had a meeting before, so I'm just jumping in now. But yeah, I'm excited to see what the trainer is like. So thank you for having me.
We've had an hour of it, so everybody's ready to train. Anybody want to take that on and do a quick presentation tour about what you've learned? Nah, just kidding. I can just feel the blood pressure going up. Oh no, we didn't know we were going to have to do a presentation today. Oh no. So now backing up, we finished the first hour talking about those 8 things from George Couros and Katie Novak's book. And as Denise pointed out, very basic, but yet actionable. And that's the whole point of that. So we were going to do a debrief, which I'm going to skip because I think this one's more important. Here, if things are working right, and I've got this wonderful light coming in through my window, which makes it look like I have a rainbow mustache. So I will lean back a little bit. What you're seeing here, obviously the second and the third row are those 8 slides side by side in the order that you saw them. Up at the top, you see the campfire image we used at the very beginning and that piece of artwork about the fire being there. And I added in 2 other images from Instagram, which were the first 2 I ever created for that George Koros and Katie Novak Instagram course book discussion group online. So the question for you, as fellow presenters, as fellow trainers and co-conspirators in the learning process, if you look left to right at the 10 Instagram images, what, if anything, do you notice as you compare them? I'm going to actually move off screen enough so that I'm not blocking any of them. I'm still here. You can unmute or you can put in a chat. What, if anything, are you noticing about the progression of those images? This is one of those moments when silence is golden. The thoughts are going. More basically, how do you react to them when you see them all together? Please don't make this one of those moments where you're looking and thinking, what does he want me to say? What I want you to do is just react unfiltered to the sight of all those images side by side.
One thing that I noticed just design wise is that the quote is really secondary. The image really, each of the images really draws your attention. And then when you read the quote, it kind of adds another dimension to your understanding of what that image means.
Wonderful. If any of you are familiar with Cliff Atkinson's book, Beyond Bullet Points, you know that he talks in there about creating slide decks that have a narrative flow. A narrative doesn't necessarily mean first you see a character do something, then he does something else, or she does something else, and then she does something else. Narrative flow can be using similar color palettes. It can be using similar images, be anything that draws you together. What happens here is what Laura was just talking about, that first you're drawn to the image and then the quote. So the narrative there is strong images. Anybody else, other observations about what they do? Seeing Denise has a quote about, or a comment about groups and solitariness. Solitariness. I love the photo of the gentleman painting, absolutely. Any other observations about the images or how they were used on Instagram and more importantly, as a training device in today's session? Don't hold back on the criticism here. If you were critiquing these, what would you say is wrong with them? And do you see anything as a result of whatever problems you can identify in any of those slides?
I think that for some of these images, they don't necessarily, I mean, they're not the best images for the concepts.
Okay.
That's how I see it. But they give you a point. I mean, I understand that.
Got it. So we could have been stronger on the images. The one thing that people seem to be dancing around is you look at those first 2 and they're very hard. Oh, there we go. Finally, Allison's hit it. They're hard to read in some cases. Especially the first 5, I was experimenting with putting the images, preparing them for Instagram through 2 different apps that allow me to put text on them and allow me to change the coloring a little bit. So on the first 4 or 5, I was stuck with what seemed to be the only font I could use. And I was never real happy with the idea that that white background around the blue lettering placed in some of those images was not as readable as I wanted it to be. When you look at that last row, you notice there's suddenly a clarity in your ability to read them. It's where I found something within the app that allowed me to put white lettering on the darker backgrounds. And when I talked earlier about slide 11 with the legs sticking out there, saying the challenge with that image was to have either black or white lettering that was readable, and the photograph didn't have enough contrast in it to be able to lay it on like I did in slides 8, 9 and 10 there. 11, you can just see it's clearly pasted on there to make it stand out. It was the best I could do. And then the final one, it works out pretty well, not great, but it works out pretty well. Again, being very critical, I could have gone back and fixed all of them. And I realized as a result of doing this exercise with another group, this is a great way to show other people as you're a trainer and they are co-conspirators in the learning process with you, that our first efforts are not always the most successful. Learning and training are iterative processes. And it's okay to share with your learners some of your failures as well as some of your successes so that they are confident that they will have that same experience and that's an okay thing to have experienced. I'm going to look at a couple more comments that have come into the chat here. Allison started off with they're hard to read in some cases. My ex was colorblind, and so color contrast has become something I'm really aware of. There are wonderful sites, by the way, where you can go out and find descriptions of the toughest color contrast for people that are colorblind. I highly recommend that you become confident or aware of that at least, and note that what Allison said, if you're having contrast problems in your slides, that you could lose some of your learners. And he said, didn't enjoy reading the box shadow text. It reminded me of visiting my ophthalmologist and reading the last line of the eye chart. Yes, let's read that one by one. You're absolutely right. I didn't enjoy reading it, but I felt in the time I had to provide that and do that particular assignment, that was what I was going to do. And there's another lesson for all of us. You have a certain amount of time to do stuff. Take that time, do the best, and then move on. Hassan says that the images weren't diverse. Women, good point. I wasn't even thinking of diversity when I was doing that. I was thinking of images and I was thinking of the text I had there. But that would be a really nice thing to have incorporated into that series. And if I ever go back and expand on it, to do another version of the slide deck you're seeing today, that would be an important thing. Denise says, but you learned something, Paul. And yes, I hope all of you learn from the mistakes I made so you don't make them. And again, I'm just laughing here because I'm trying to make sure that this little thing that's coming in the window doesn't go there. Something that we're going to be covering in session 3, but it's coming up right now. And so I'm just going to take full advantage of it. You need in the room that you're working with to be exquisitely aware of everything that could be going on there. We'll talk more about this right now, but understand that the lighting I'm using primarily is behind my laptop. It's what's called a ring light. So it casts fairly even light over my face. I'm in a room in my house that faces east. And so the back windows are facing east. This time of the morning, the sun starts to come through. I've got the shades drawn, even though I love glancing out into my backyard, I've got the shades drawn to prevent the extra light coming in and washing out the color of my face. But obviously there's one little opening in the drapes that's giving that prismatic color. And if I sit just right, it's there. Be aware of that. Don't let it panic you. You can do what I'm doing right now. I'm just going to lean into the camera a little bit more closely until that little prism disappears, unless I want to sing songs about rainbows and make it a part of the thing. Again, a theme here that we'll come back to a little later, improv. You're sitting there, you're doing this, you see that there. And instead of ignoring it, you just draw it in and you make it part of the routine and you draw whatever humor you can. It's like, look, I've got rainbow sideburns. I had no idea I could do that. It's the latest Zoom filter. The more we can do a basic improv thing, and instead of saying no, or yes, but, and say yes, and, when that rainbow hits your face, you say yes, and I'm going to make a joke out of it and I'm going to move on. These are all things that we think about as we're doing our train the trainer stuff. I want to hit a few people that I think are really great resources for you. And again, you can always go back to the deck and pull the names out if you don't get them quickly enough here. We've obviously talked about George and Katie enough so that this is just a final call out saying if you haven't read their work, it's well worth reading if and when you have the time. Now, another person I absolutely adore is Peter Block, who's a consultant who wrote the book on consulting quite a while ago. Peter's a very outgoing guy, very gentle. Typical story of Peter and what makes him so admirable to somebody like me. When I was starting my consulting business well over a decade ago, I reached out to Peter and said, in your book on consulting, there's one line there that just goes to the heart of what I want to do. Are you okay with my using that on my webpage as long as I attribute it to you? Not more than 24 hours later, I heard back from Peter. He said, oh, absolutely, and best of luck with your business. Now that's cool. That's very generous. That's very sweet. But the real Peter story is a year later, I was at a conference. This was in 2008 down in San Diego. He was doing a session on the book that you see behind me, Community, the Structure of Belonging. So I went to that session, and before it started, I had a chance to walk up to him. There were about 250 or 300 of us in the room. Went up, handed him my business card, not expecting him after that whole year of one single contact to remember me. I handed him my card and said, Peter, I just wanted to say thank you. And before I could get out the last of that sentence, he said, oh, how's your business going? He remembered. That was stunning. So let us look at what we see in that quote there and stop long enough to read that. Let us think about somebody at Peter Block's level who lectures all over the world, in fact, lecture is not the right word. Peter facilitates sessions on community and on training and on consulting. And he just can reach out and make you in a moment feel like he really cares. You're the most important person in the whole room to him. And as we think about community and building communities of learning, let's look at Peter's work and learn from that. Again, a book I highly recommend if you have the time and the inclination to read it. And finally, Clark, who I mentioned a little bit earlier, this is a fantastic book, Revolutionized Learning and Development. Let's start with this quote. And let me do something I haven't done very much in today's presentation, which is take the time to read something. This is something that I think a lot of people are worried about in training, especially online, that if you're speaking to somebody, you don't want to take the time to look away and break the eye contact. For the longest time, I too was concerned about that. I would not take the time, especially when there was video going, to stop and read something to people. And then I thought about maybe half a year ago, that's so silly. If we were in an offsite setting and I was in front of the room or in the middle of the room walking around as I usually do to make eye contact with people, we were in the middle of the room. There would be times when I would pull up my notes as I have here right now, and I would read your quote because reading the quote is much more effective than trying to paraphrase it. And it dawned on me, why can we not do that in an online environment? And there's no reason why not. So here's what I adore about Clark's book. In the very beginning, when he's just an iconoclast and says, let's look at the good, the bad, and the ugly of what we do. Opening words on the first couple pages. Let me be blunt. The current state of learning and development, L&D, the learning and development industry, is failing. Overall, L&D is only doing a fraction of what it could and should be doing. And the part that it is doing poorly. It's like, oh, that just, boom, nails it. Let's look at what's good, what's bad, and what's ugly about our training. And when we've got somebody of Clark's background, Clark's experience saying, our industry really sucks and we need to do something about it. I don't know about you, but I sit up and I want to know more. And the whole book is an exploration of what we're not doing that we could be doing, how we could easily improve things in our work, in our industry, and be more effective for the learners that we work with. So again, highly recommend Clark's book on revolutionizing learning and development. It's an eye opener. It's fun. He is funny. He is witty. I've seen somebody in a direct message. I'm not going to say who it is, but I'm going to go ahead and read it just to see. Yeah, this is fair game, and I'm glad we're having this kind of conversation. This is not a criticism, but since we live in a multicultural world, you may wish to consider other voices, namely from leaders of color and women leaders. I think it will further enrich your work in this presentation. Just a suggestion, I ask your forgiveness. No forgiveness needed. Has not offended me at all. We're in this together. We need to be better. And in fact, good that we are hearing this on day one. You can be sure on day two, the slide deck or whatever I use is going to be a little bit more inclusive. These are good things for us to hear. We have to be big enough to hear them. We have to be big enough to share them with our learners and say, mea culpa. I'm not standing here as the expert pretending I know it all. Great point. I really thank you for saying that. So anybody else who's got comments like that, these sessions are for you. We need to make sure that you are comfortable and that I'm learning too. Good point. So final word here on Clark and on the thing I just showed you. And again, on things you think about when you're doing training. One of the final things I did yesterday before finalizing this deck was to look back through in what's called slide sorter, where you can see all the slides in little thumbnails and you can see what's working and what's not working. I realized that the color scheme I was working was very specific in terms of having a specific color, the green that you see on slides where there was a specific thing I was trying to pass on as a learning element. I was pretty consistent as, well, we'll hit it eventually. You see in the discussions that the discussions use a blue typeface to kind of differentiate them out. Now, I don't expect learners to notice that, but at a subliminal level, I think it's just another part of the design process that makes it easier for people. at that subconscious level to see what's going on and to identify what's important and what's working at a certain level. Final thing I did was I was looking at this slide and the one before it, where the original type was blue, and I thought, oh, wait a minute, I've been using the blue type for discussions, and I'm using it for quotes. So I just changed it out again, using the color scheme from the CLA logo, the green, the blue, and the orange, and just made the simple thing of changing over those quotes to an orange so they would stand out in their own thing. Now, that is an extremely obsessive compulsive part of what we do. And yet I think it does make a difference for our learners, and it makes it easier for them. I wanted to point that out to you as I was going through that. It's something to think about in your own presentation decks. And the final part of what was going to be earlier was when you were talking about goals and objectives and where the course was going. One of the advanced things I had put out for you, for anybody that had the time to look at it, was this article. You can see the URL again at the bottom of the screen. It's from a company called Talent LMS. And they have these two sections you can see: to save time, essential skills, and the following must-haves. Now, I don't at all subscribe to these being must-have tools for those of us in libraries. These are nice to have, and if you have them, run with them. But a lot of libraries simply don't have the budgets to invest in a very expensive learning management system, or to invest in content authoring tools to make a lot of videos. A lot of us doing training in libraries don't have time to make the videos or to use video editing software. But if you're going to move up to that level, these are great things to do. So let me stop so you can, again, for those of you that looked at it, this is a refresher. For those that didn't have a chance to look at that article, here's something that sets a framework for us as we continue over the next 5 sessions. Any questions about those top 5 items about research skills, communication, organizational adaptability, or enthusiasm for lifelong learning, or any observations? Okay, if not, second thing, and there was a short video, I think it was about 6 or 7 minutes long. Here's the essence of it from almost the final part of it, where the person was summarizing 7 steps for effective training and coaching. So they're all there. You'll notice, as we discussed quite openly earlier on in this session, that you want to make sure that these things are done at some point. But again, it's up to you with your own comfort level and the levels of your learners and their preferences, whether you want to do these right up front in the traditional way of starting off the first 5 or 10 minutes with explaining the objectives and explaining the procedures, or if you want to try that technique that I was using. Again, I'm looking at the author's name here, Priya Parker's idea of jumping in with the cold open. The cold open is where at the beginning of the session, as soon as you start your formal presentation, you tell a story or you do something dramatic that pulls learners in and sets a framework. I really love that. And I'm not saying that it's better than other methods, but it's something that's been working for me and I really enjoy doing it. Let's see. I think that covers it. Any questions? Because I'm going to go back just one slide again. This slide and this slide are about as close as I'm coming to doing a traditional thing of saying, here's some structure. These are the things that we're going to keep coming back to. And if you get buried under all the information I'm throwing at you today, these would be the 2 slides you go back to, the essential things of thinking about what you're going to do. All right, we're going to shift gears here, and we're into our last half hour. So we won't get as far as I thought we were going to get today in the slide deck. But again, fine, we've done so much more that was important. What I'll probably do in our next session is just pick up with the last part of the slide deck and cover the things that I don't want to race through and then move into the next couple things. There's going to be plenty of time for us to do all this over the 6 sessions. So I'm one of those trainers that's not going to worry. I'm also going to look back and I see that Denise has a couple comments. In total transparency, I need to work on my inability to be adaptable. We all do. I sometimes facilitate change management sessions. And again, my cold opening is to say, all right, we're here to talk about how you can make change that is positive and progressive for your situation to deal with the pain point that you have as a learner. But let me tell you right up, change is not always easy for me either. I'm the first person to admit that before COVID, if somebody suggested changing the coffee shop I went to for my morning coffee, I would scream and cry and kick, even if the coffee shop up the street was better. We all have our habits and our levels of adaptability. For mine, it's just the comfort of being in a place where I see people I know and interact with people that I'm comfortable interacting with, and that works for me. So I told the need to be adaptable, something we all constantly can work on and should work on. And I'm also seeing that, oh, Denise, I'm seeing Priya Parker, who will be one of 2 keynote speakers at the American Association of Museum in June. I'm reading Parker's Why We Gather. I'm officially jealous. I'm glad we're not being recorded because I wouldn't want people to know I'm jealous of one of my learners, but I'm jealous. That's great. The change has to be logical. Obviously, Denise is going out for one thing. Some changes are downright stupid, not well thought out. Yeah, let's not be part of that. All right, so what are we doing now? We're going to start getting into some of the ideas of techniques that we can use and tools that will allow us to be better trainers. And of course, the whole environment for many of us has changed in this last year, because in early March last year, most of our training that most of us were doing in libraries, I think, were probably face-to-face with a little bit of online. Most universities had some hybrid learning going on, where there was some face-to-face and some online. And the ones that were doing a lot of online or exclusively online were the rare birds who either were doing it very well because they've been doing it for years, or they were experimenting and weren't very good at it. Come mid-March 2020, as you'll remember, it flipped overnight. And that's what this slide is about. A quick story here. I had been in Tampa for a Train the Trainer series that I did with librarians there in early March of 2020. And we were lucky. We set it up so that we were going to do face-to-face the first full day of the workshop. And we would meet once every 3 weeks for hour-long online sessions that were the follow-up. And nobody knew when we designed it that way that it would be timed perfectly, that the face-to-face thing took place just before COVID shut us down. And then we moved online. So that was a situation where we were prepped for it, didn't even feel the pain. In this case, the slide I'm showing is from a conference. I was a week and a half later in Tempe, Arizona for a group called Shaping EDU, a lovely group of educators from all over the world. 200 of us were supposed to be there for our annual unconference, where we'd gather and we'd talk about the work we were doing and what we hope to do in the following year. With COVID kicking in, a lot of people were being told by their employers, you cannot fly. So the conference, instead of 200 people being on site, was down to about 40 of us on site for day one. But we already had the technology in place to be putting stuff out. I can't remember if it had to be Zoom, because that's what we're looking at here. So we had Zoom there. We had a professional tech crew on site. And for day one, where 40 of us were there and a bunch of other people came in online, it was a hybrid conference. But the panic was setting in. By the end of that day, rumors were floating around that airlines were going to be shutting down. We had people from all over the country. So the conference organizers, recognizing that we had an online component already in place, that we often operated throughout the year in online settings, and were comfortable with that, and people were freaking out that they wouldn't be able to get home, said at the end of day one, if you want to go home tonight, we'll continue the conference online completely tomorrow. So a bunch of people made their reservations. Only 3 of us stayed on site, but most people went home. They ended that day. We actually had time before people caught their flights to have some dinners together. And then people got their flights, went home. Next morning, 9 o'clock is what you're seeing here. We all logged back on, and the facilitator said, we've just taken a mostly on-site conference online overnight. Let us take advantage of that, and let's do a global wave at each other. And so that's the snapshot of people waving. You'll see I was the one person that was having tech problems. You see right behind my head, my logo showed up, because that was the moment my laptop decided, I'm not going to show your picture anymore, just your logo. But we went on with it. We had a good time, and we did business. So what does that tell us as people involved in training trainers? We need to be adaptable. But we can only be adaptable so far. We need to have certain things in place if we're going to make those transformations. And in this case, Shaping EDU had what it needed. It had people comfortable working face-to-face as well as online. It had people that were tech advisors who had the technology on site to take that thing online overnight and to bring people in. We had a group that was willing to do that. And we had a small enough group that was flexible. Many of the people shown in those pictures, by the way, are educators working in universities. That whole first day while we were on site trying to do business, they kept being called out of meetings because their universities were having to make that same dynamic transformation overnight to take university students online. So they'd be in a meeting, they'd have to run outside and say, well, try this, try that. And as soon as I get back, we'll do this. This was an incredibly adaptive group of people. And I hold them up to you as people that are great exemplars of what we want to be when we are trainers and learning facilitators in the rooms we work. So a quick review here of some themes that I think are really important for us to think about. What landscapes are we working in? Well, clearly right now, We're primarily in online, and we're looking at the idea of going back. Something that has struck me since day one of this is my most progressive colleagues in learning and in training looked at the first days of the pandemic and what was going on with learning and said, please do not make the mistake of thinking that this is online learning. We are scrambling. Many of us do not have in place the tools that we need, the video tools to make videos, the bandwidth to be able to put lessons out live or asynchronously. Let us recognize that we are in what's called emergency remote learning, and let us not judge these efforts against long-term, well-established online learning practices. And that's where a lot of people, oh, I'm sorry, somebody's, I'm seeing some chat here that I wasn't paying attention to. So Mahasan has her hand up. Go ahead, Mahasan. What would you like to ask?
Oh yeah, it was earlier when we were talking about the like cold open versus
Yes.
more traditional, like here's where we are and here's where we're going. And I just wondering if you had any thoughts. There's a lot of conversations about like how to structure presentations for that don't just favor those who are neurotypical. So I'm trained as a children's librarian, and we're talking more and more about like creating presentations and programs that speak to the needs of those who have diverse learning needs. And so I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that, like whether I hear from like my more introverted colleagues or folks who might be on the spectrum or just have different learning needs, that there are ways to make presentations more easier to digest. So I just wonder if you had any thoughts or feedback, or if you might have a space where you're going to talk about that.
I've just made a note to myself to make sure that we cover that when we start talking about how to prepare things. I am not going to pretend that I am in any way an expert on it. I'm aware of the issue. And my baby advice to you up front, until we can get further into this and I can give you some readings to look at and we can have a discussion around it. My basic advice is always, 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 as much as possible, know who your learners are so you can spot those things up front. If you get into a situation and something comes up that you did not anticipate, like you've got a bunch of colorful slides and somebody walks in who's completely sight impaired and can't see those slides, step A is we need to be good enough to notice, oh, that the learning that I have proposed to do for this person isn't going to work. And B, have a way to adapt quickly. But that comes from a lot of reading, a lot of experience. The simple babyish thing is to use that example of somebody who's totally sight impaired. I see somebody like that come into a classroom I'm working, or see them online in a session I'm working, realize we have an issue. I would just say to everybody, we're going to be doing things a little bit differently today. For people that have trouble seeing what's on the screen, I'm going to be describing them a little bit. So if I were doing a thing like this and saying, we're going to talk about blended learning, and I'm pointing out to you through the use of an image here with a bunch of green balls and one red apple, that blending starts with the idea, and just work it, improv on the spot, to not keep calling attention to the person who is different than the other learners, but to accommodate them in a way that feels natural. So that's a starting point. Does that help a little bit, Mahasan? Good. And thanks, Christine, for calling attention to the hands up there. If I'm not seeing stuff in the chat, just unmute yourself and go, yo, I have a question. We need to deal with this. Again, that's how we're going to be working this session. So our landscape, blended learning. I was talking about how my best colleagues were looking at the initial stage of what we're doing as emergency remote learning, which should not be judged the same way you would judge a fully developed, long-standing online program. Some places are still in that. Some people have not dealt with online learning in an effective way. They're still just going by the seat of the pants, waiting for a chance when they can, quote unquote, go back to normal. The best colleagues I had about 2 to 3 weeks into this, and that's all it took for the best of them, because they had a lot of stuff in place. They started saying, all right, so now we're moving into online learning. And we want to see what we can do to expand that and deal with some of the issues that are coming up that weren't anticipated, like people who don't have broadband. We can't rely on them having access to the lessons we're trying to put out there. They're not going to be able to interact with us. We've all seen those terrible pictures of kids sitting in parking lots. I've had the experience of walking by a local branch library here in San Francisco, where you assume we're close to Silicon Valley, everybody should be connected. I still see people sitting outside buildings that are closed to the public because there's Wi-Fi, and that's their whole connection. They're using those Wi-Fi connections. We have a great colleague in Texas, Diane Connery at Pottsboro Library, who early on in the pandemic realized that the library needed to be responsive to people that did not have broadband. And there were large parts of that rural community where broadband was not a given. So Diane worked with city officials and with local businesses, and the solution was brilliant. It got her national attention. They made a deal with a conference center just outside of town to use the parking lot where there was plenty of room to park and put a big mobile hotspot there so people could have broadband that was provided through a consortium of the library, the businesses, and that conference center. This is how creative we have to be, but it goes into, if we're going to do online learning, what's going to work and what are we going to do? And finally, for me, the third of the three stages that I've seen so far in this whole pandemic in terms of learning is starting with remote emergency learning and then getting into some really good online learning. And then going back to something which I have adored for a long time, which is blended. You either start on site and go online like the situation I talked about from Tampa, or you might start online and occasionally have face-to-face meetings, which is more or less what Shaping EDU has. But for me, the issue here in phase 3 of COVID in terms of learners is, are we going to stay with the idea of going back to quote unquote normal, or are we going to create a new normal? Or as the best of the people that I work with say, are we going to create a new and better normal? Because normal was not all that great before this. There were lots of problems and there's still lots of things to address. That's why so many of us are involved in promoting broadband. We see that as a big issue for online learning. Those of us who decide that we want to be part of creating the new and better normal, we're hoping that we won't just lose the advantages we picked up and the experience we've picked up, that we will apply that to our blended learning environments and be better for it as a result. I see Denise is saying, I hope that, I'm assuming you're saying you hope we won't go back to normal and that it will engender innovation. That's where I'm at. And I would challenge all of you to be part of that, creating the new and better normal and looking at blended learning as one possibility for you. Flipped classroom, there's a lot of misunderstanding about this. I love the image, by the way. I obviously loved it enough to want to use it here. Flipped classroom is a misunderstood thing. The organizers themselves, the creators of the flipped classroom model, have said explicitly, there's no such thing as a flipped classroom. You just don't walk into a room and it's suddenly flipped. It's a model of education that came out of the need of these two teachers. I believe they were high school teachers who were teaching in a rural area, and their learners, oftentimes if they wanted to be in extracurricular activities, had to be off campus while some of the lessons were going on. If they wanted to be in after school sports, they were on a bus that would take them out of the classroom. So their idea was, let's film some of what we do and put those videos up so that the students that cannot be there can review the videos at night and not miss anything. Well, it evolved in a wonderful way. They created this whole model where instead of having people being lectured to, when we have like what I call our face-to-face online meeting today, where we're interacting with each other, or in this situation where the teachers were interacting with the learners on site, they didn't want to spend, and in fact, they used the term waste. They didn't want to waste that face-to-face time with lecture. They wanted to give the basic background through a couple of video lectures in short. They chunked them. They didn't just do 2 or 3 hour lectures and then say, go watch that. That is not what Flipped Classroom is about. This was concisely giving people information and using our learning time together to engage in application of the learning so that you walked away with something. Again, hood open here. That's the approach we're taking in these series of sessions together. You're going to see some of those videos up front. You'll hear me talk about stuff, but we'll be doing a lot to apply what you learn as we go along. I see another comment from Denise. Public libraries have always had tutorial sessions. Absolutely. Doing class online constantly will not help children grow to love learning. Yeah, I go a certain extent and meet you almost like 90% of the way on that one, Denise. The only place where I would differ is in saying it absolutely that doing class online will not help children grow to love learning. If it's done effectively and if the learners are old enough, I think that they can and will love learning, but it requires an awful lot of us. We have to be so much better than we've been in face-to-face settings where we kind of slough it. Really, you cannot hide in an online setting if you're not doing things that are engaging the learners. They're just going to zone out and nothing's going to happen, and you have no way of knowing that. So you have to build that in. But I think we're pretty much on the same page there, that with online learning, it's got to be engaging. and the public libraries in many ways have been at the forefront of this. Allison says, I've also heard a lot of kids who had trouble at school in person doing well online, like those who have been bullied, etc. It works both ways. There are fantastic success stories like the one Allison's just talked about. There are tragic stories like one I heard at a broadband session I was part of about a month ago, where you had a second grader that was an outgoing kid, really a great learner. When she had to go into online learning, the issue was the broadband was not good enough in her house for her to be able to engage. She started to get depressed. She was falling behind, and she actually ended up with formal counseling to help her through the worst of that situation. So there's 2, if not 4 or 6 sides to every story, and we need to be good enough to be looking at all of those. Denise says, good point, Allison. And Allison says, I know someone whose 7-year-old daughter stopped eating because she got so depressed through online school. So yeah, both sides, something we see. I love flipped classroom because it actually keeps us in one of those key points I keep making here, which is we want to be learner-centric. Flipped classroom is learner-centric. Flipped classroom model is learner-centric to the extent that you are giving the learners maximum ability and the time you'll have all together to achieve something that is transformative and memorable. And for that, I really encourage those of you that haven't tried it yet to engage in it. We'll do a little bit of that as we go on. Experiential is right behind this. If we don't experience what we are learning, if we don't walk that walk and actually figure things out by following the paths that we need to and deviating from those paths at the times that we need to deviate from them, we're missing an important part. I'm not going to say a lot about this at this point because I hope that it's obvious to you that all we're saying here is experiential is hands-on learning and it's something to incorporate in online environments as well as face-to-face. Problem-based, here we are back to that labyrinth, walking that and trying to solve a problem. If we make problem-based challenges, we are learner-centric in the idea that the learners themselves are helping to define the problems that they want to resolve. That's why up front, I told you earlier today in this session that I want you thinking about the things you picked up from your leadership lessons in this whole leadership program that you're in through the California Library Association. Pick out things that were most meaningful to you and that you want to translate for your learners back in your own workplace and design at least the beginnings of a rudimentary training you can use. So really up front, we're already starting in the assessment phase. You want to, in assessment, determine what the real learning need is and whether training is the answer to it. If that's the case, then you'll develop it beyond that. So as we start to wind down today's session, already be thinking in terms of problem-based learning and what you're going to be doing. And then we're back to Clark with his book, Millennials, Goldfish, and Other Training Misconceptions, which is, as you see in the subtitle, Debunking Learning Myths and Superstitions. Clark, as you gather, is playful and, as I said, iconoclastic. And the whole title of The Goldfish comes from the idea of there's this myth out there that learning attention spans are shrinking more and more these days. And Clark says he keeps hearing people say, our attention span has shrunk so much that goldfish have longer attention spans than we have. And Clark's the kind of guy who says, oh, okay, yeah, right. How long is a goldfish's attention span and what research do you have to show that? So far, Clark hasn't been able to find any research that establishes what the actual attention span of a goldfish is. So playfully with this book, in 2 or 3 page chapters, he takes on numerous myths that we have, including what we talked about when the recording had stopped during the break, the whole myth of learning styles. Research over the last several years has suggested that this idea that people have learning styles and you have to adapt to those, research is showing that that's not the case, that somebody who has believed that their learning style was kinesthetic can learn as effectively, audibly, or visually if the learning is done right, and vice versa. So a nice thing to do here, if you really want to take yourself into being an effective trainer, is watch for these books like what Clark has written and what so many other people are doing in terms of what research shows us. Understand research is subject to change. It's the whole thing of Thomas Kuhn and the scientific method of it's a paradigm until somebody breaks the paradigm and then we move to the new paradigm. But we need to be aware of the fact that some of what we're basing our learning techniques on, our teaching techniques on, are outdated. And it doesn't mean that there's not some truth in it. I want to be explicit when I talk about these learning styles. I believe we have learning preferences. I've not seen anybody that's done any research saying we don't prefer certain things, but that's different than believing that it's a style that is innate and it's locked into the mind up here that you have to address that. It sort of takes us back to what somebody was asking about earlier about neurotypical things. We need to be aware of that And research will probably help us to understand that more and more as time goes by. With the best tools we have and the best colleagues we have to bounce ideas off of, these are things that we can use in our learning to make things better. Seeing that Denise is saying she has an 11 o'clock meeting, so has to step away. This is fine. Remember, this is a guilt-free zone. You come as you have time to come. I hope you can stay for everything. And if you don't have time to stay for everything, I hope you have time to watch the recordings. But again, get what you can out of this. That's what learner-centric learning is about. You as co-conspirators in the process are helping you define what we're going to do and where we go. So what benefits and challenges do we face as we think about introducing these elements of our learning landscape into our trainer roadmap? And again, just trying to be helpful here, I put those terms up there on the screen so that you can see them. Please unmute. Let's take a couple minutes to see how what we've done together in session 1 here today is going to help you to do the work you want to do. I'm trying to position myself so I don't block this out. There we go. Anybody? Go ahead, Victor.
No, I'm still here. I just unmuted. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Don't be sorry. Zoom has a wonderful way of muting you just when you thought you were unmuted, and sometimes unmuting you. Anybody want to drop comments into the chat or say anything here?
Well, I was just thinking about how this would play out at work. Like, you know, training is often, I don't want to say it's secondary, but it's you were all got a ton of tasks with a limited amount of time and not necessarily a lot of time to invest in getting like really good at something. And so I'm just thinking about like trying what it would look like to improve the quality of certain things at work and like where that would fit in into a busy schedule of people already having so many things. It's like I need like a couple weeks to pause and then and dig in and it's hard to find that time to like regroup and learn and dig in to make things better.
We're talking about a paradigm shift here, and this is not a new thing. I've been seeing this and hearing this for at least 20 years that I've been involved in training, teaching, learning. We tend, especially in the training field, to see training as something that takes people out of the workplace, and the goal is to get them back in the workplace as quickly as possible. And I've been saying for well over a decade now, each of us who takes this seriously needs to be an advocate for the idea that training is not a diversion. Training is not taking people out of their workplace and then putting them back in. Training is an essential part of being an employee and a productive employee who can keep up with what's going on and keeping, if it's a professional business, keeping it competitive. If it's a nonprofit or a government agency like a library, it's keeping it serviceable to the people that it's working with. If we all said, I got hired 20 years ago and the library information system that we had then is the only one I'm ever going to use, we wouldn't be in our jobs very long. And we have to see training as that essential thing. So part of it is on us to make sure that the training that we provide is essential and productive and meaningful. And in our workplaces, we have to advocate for training as an essential element of the workplace expectations, that everybody is expected to be engaged in lifelong learning at a level that keeps them up with what's going on. And keep it engaging, keep it fun, keep it memorable. I don't often drop stats, but I'm going to drop something from one of the videos that you'll see for the next session. And it's a thing called the 6 Disciplines of Successful Learning. It's a wonderful system. And the gist of what they talk about is when they started doing their research well over 10 years ago, they were working in the corporate learning field. And they found that about 85% of training was not being used 6 months later. So people are going to training, they might use a little bit, 6 months later, they were back to doing what they did. What industry allows you to have an 85% failure rate? That is terrible. Slap us, really, let's get better at this. So to develop a system that shows training not just as events like what we're doing today, but as a process. It involves the manager and the learner meeting ahead of time, deciding why the person's going to that training and what's going to be different when they come back. The day of the learning in best situations, which is hard, of course, but in best situations, the manager or supervisor or the head of the library would be in the training session to see how it was going and what was being done. And the important thing was afterwards, there was support in the workplace to make it impossible not to use that. We don't do enough of that. But what the research showed was that number flipped. 85% of the people going through that system where there was follow-up support and weekly reminders to them about how to use that training, 85% were now still using it 6 months later, as opposed to the 85% of what they call training scrap, what you leave on the table. That's stunning. And that's about as good a place as any to say, we're in the last couple of minutes here, so let's not do the rest of, we're not going to try to jam a bunch of other stuff in here, but I'm going to very quickly go to one of the last couple slides here. You're going to see the whole slide deck in 5 seconds or less, because I want you to see the resources for session 2. You should be getting this from Christine later today, but if you want to jot down any of the titles, these are all very short videos. The first one is what I was just talking about, introducing the 6 Ds, 6 disciplines of breakthrough learning. Roy Polak is one of the 3. There were 4 of them who wrote the first edition, and then 3 who did the subsequent edition. So Roy, in about a minute, introduces the 6 Ds, and I highly recommend that to you. That'll set us up for a productive discussion in session 2, using this as the precursor to the flipped classroom. We're also in session 2 going to get into talking about instructional design models to help you know that what you have assessed in terms of learner needs plays out in what you design and you deliver. So we're going to get introduced to the ADDIE model, which starts with assessment and talks about design and development. I is the implementation stage, that's the day of delivery, and E is the evaluation. So there's a very nice quick video introducing you to ADDIE. And finally, thinking in terms of evaluation, which obviously comes at the end of the process and oftentimes doesn't get enough attention from us. Kirkpatrick was somebody who back in the 1950s created what he called 4 levels of evaluation, and that has stuck with us for decades now. Kirkpatrick passed away about 5 or 6 years ago, but his family is keeping that whole system going and doing workshops on it. And again, with this brief video, it gives you things to think about as you move into evaluation. I like introducing this early into our train the trainer stuff, because most people think evaluation is the last thing you do, but something that we learn by using Kirkpatrick and other evaluation models is, if your assessment up front is good enough, you have created benchmarking by which your evaluation will be held. So it's totally circular. If you do a good job up front, the evaluation phase is a piece of cake, because you know what to measure for. You've taught to that, you've encouraged that, you've engaged your learners in that, and you can see those results and document them. What could be better? So that's where we're going. Last minute before we log out, any last minute questions or anything that's not clear to you from what we said today that you really want to make sure you got? I'm going to put my email address into, oh, we never got to the discussion about platforms. Think about that. We'll come back to that at the beginning of the next session. How, if at all, do you want to communicate between sessions and have discussions that are not in the recordings? I'm going to put my email address in the chat for you. You should have it on the emails that Christine has been sending out. So if you have any questions, oh, I'm sorry, I sent that directly to Martine. Another trainer thing, if you're going to send a chat to everybody, make sure you see who the chat is going to before you hit send. Now you and Martine all have my email address. Last call for questions while the recording's on. I will stay for a few minutes after we stop the recording. Last thing, anybody want to ask anything before we end today's session? Well, thank you very much. It's been wonderful interacting with you. I'm looking forward to the next sessions already. I'm going to take the comments that a few of you made about things to incorporate in and make sure that those are incorporated in for the follow-up sessions. We'll stop the recording now. For those of you watching the archive version, thanks. Hope this was helpful and hope that you'll come back for more.